So now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to welcome today's discussion moderator, Sean Simpson, Senior Vice President of Ipsos Canada Public Affairs. Sean, you have the floor.
Well, thanks very much, Ellen. I appreciate the introduction. I'm joined here today with the Global CEO of Ipsos Public Affairs, Dr. Darrell Bricker. So when we say ask me anything, it's not me that's going to be answering anything, actually, this discussion. It's going to be Darrell Bricker. We'll start off today's presentation with about a half a dozen slides, some of the data that we've been collecting in partnership with our media partners at Global News. We've been in field every week since prior to the campaign, and of course through the campaign. We'll continue right up until election day. So we'll share some of the data that we're seeing through that polling, and then the vast majority of today's discussion will be posing to Darrell the questions that you've put in the chat, and some that we've received ahead of time as well, and listen to what Darrell has to say about the trends, the figures, and what's likely to happen on election day, and the implications for Canada and businesses in Canada beyond the election. So Darrell, over to you. What are we seeing in the numbers?
Well, I think it's pretty clear that what's happened over the space of the last week or so is that the race has tightened up, and you see it in the two lines there, the blue and the red line on the right-hand side of your screen. Pardon me. The Liberals have the 12-point lead that we had them at. I think we're a little high on where the Liberals were previously, but it's come down to about 6, which is about the market average. But we've certainly noticed a decline in Liberal support and a slight rise in conservative support. One thing that's been consistent in all the polls and has been consistent in our polling is the really desperate decline of the NDP. In some polls now around in single digits, but in our polling we have them at around 10. This would be a performance online with what they were doing in the early 1990s, which was a time when they didn't even have official party status. So a desperate situation for the NDP. Next slide, Sean.
Oh, pardon me, sorry.
Now, the thing about the vote is what we call in social science a dependent variable. It changes after everything else changes. So things change and that vote changes. And what you're seeing here is the response to various events, and for example, Justin Trudeau's resignation. But one of the things that is a really good leading indicator of how a party is performing in an election campaign is whether or not the public believes that that government deserves re-election, or it's time for somebody else to take over and run Canada's government. As you can see, there was a really big level of support for changing the government going all the way back to September 21, but it was even high prior to that. It's been about 2 years. And with the appointment of Mark Carney, actually the victory of Mark Carney as the leader of the Liberal Party, we've seen that time for a change number has declined quite dramatically. So it's come together quite a bit over the space of the election campaign. But over the space of the last week, remember I said, vote is a dependent variable. This is one of the independent variables that causes vote to change, and we've seen that time for a change has started to creep back up. So that's one indicator that things are heading a bit more, I would say, in a conservative direction at the present time. Sean? In terms of issues, what are the most important issues? And I need to say right off the top here, well, it's not right off the top, it's close to the middle, but we have never had Canada's relationship with the United States as the most important issue in the election campaign. It's never topped our issues. It's always been affordability, cost of living, most important to Canadians. Now, the important thing obviously is that one is somewhat tied to the other, but the affordability issue has been the number1 issue all through the course of this campaign. I'll show you in a couple seconds what the effect of Canada's relationship with the United States has had, but we need to keep in mind that what people are most concerned about is what's happening to them, their immediate family within their own four walls, and then in their close community. And it's that sense of a lack of middle-class progress that really is driving a lot of that time for a change in the affordability question that we see reflected here in the survey results. Next slide, please. And when you take a look at the issues that are under play here, I want to go all the way to the far right-hand side of the slides where it's Canada's relationship with the United States. I have never seen, and Sean and I were counting this up prior to this call, this is my 12th federal election. I have never seen on a major issue a party with a 62-point lead. So this is over the Conservative Party. If this election is about Canada's relationship with the United States, and for a time it has been about that, which is why we saw the Liberals go up to with a 12-point lead. The Liberals are going to be in very, very good place. But as we drift off of that issue, and we've been drifting off of it a little bit over the space of the last week, we go back to affordability and cost of living. Actually, the Conservatives have a lead on that. And I would say the biggest element of affordability of cost of living that people are looking at is the question of housing, which the Conservatives have exactly the same level of lead on. So if we're drifting back into the evaluation of the last 10 years of the Liberal government and whether people feel that they're doing better now than they did before, that is an environment that works very, very well for the Conservative Party. If we're focusing on what the big orange man south of the border is saying about Canada becoming the 51st state, it's obviously a great position for the Liberal Party. Next slide, please. Best Prime Minister of Canada. So the way this works in terms of how all of this locks together almost like pieces of Lego or like Rubik's Cube is the first thing that changes is what people feel the priority issues are, the level of intensity on the priority of issues. That causes people to consider whether or not we need to have a change in government, which then causes them to look at who the best leader would be for Canadians, which then affects how they look at vote. And what we see here is that vote and leadership approval or preference for best prime minister moves in absolute lockstep with party support. So it's not that party support affects leadership, it's that leadership affects party support. The way I would describe what's been happening is we've moved from a time for a change election to an election about leadership on a very specific issue, which is about Canada's relationship with the United States. Over the last week, we've drifted away from that a little bit, and that previous agenda has come back into the conversation, which has caused affordability become more of an intense issue in the election campaign, which has affected time for a change, affected leadership, and then affected vote. So that's what we're seeing. The question over the next 2 weeks is how that dynamic is going to work itself out. And on leadership, this really clearly underscored. One of the things that Pierre Poilievre has done is demonstrated that he's a very aggressive questioner, great leader of the opposition. But the old expression is, if you campaign to be leader of the opposition, that's what you become. And that's honestly what's happening to Pierre Poilievre right now. He has to look more like a prime minister who's in waiting. And also his level of maturity, particularly around issues like dealing with Donald Trump, questions about that, concerns about a hidden agenda, that parallel again with Donald Trump does him no good. But Mark Carney, on all the things that you would be looking at for somebody to sort of calm down what the political situation is, he does really well on those things. Now, the interesting thing is it's not so much that people actually have any evidence of this. He just basically looks the part and comes across as the part and presents himself as the part. The Liberals have had a very specific, very focused campaign, just like John Turner did back in 1988, when we're going to focus on this one issue and try and drive the campaign. It really works well when that's the issue that's most intense in the campaign, but when it doesn't, Mark Carney tends to flounder a little bit. And that's the point at which Pierre Poilievre, even with these detriments on the in terms of his personal character and that kind of thing, he at least looks like somewhat like more like a change than Mark Carney does, and that gives him an advantage. So how free trade plays into the campaign affects how everything is going to happen with both the leaders, the sense of priority on the issues, the sense of whether or not there's a time for a change, then ultimately how people are going to vote.
So Darrell, what should be watching for in the debates in the final week of the campaign?
Okay, that's a great question, Sean. So let me tell you my experience. Debates generally don't matter very much, but when they do, they really do. So Joe Biden crawling on the stage against Donald Trump, obviously had a huge impact on the campaign, and we ended up with a different candidate than the incumbent president in that election. But then again, Kamala Harris, I think by every measure, cleaned up in that debate that she had with Donald Trump, and it made no difference to her, to the viability of her campaign. We've seen similar things in Canada. What tends to happen in Canadian debates, federal election debates, is people are somewhat acquainted with the individuals who are debating. So, in the last election campaign, people were acquainted with Jagmeet Singh. They were acquainted with Aaron O'Toole. They were acquainted with Justin Trudeau. All that happened in that debate is they basically reinforced what people already thought of them previously. This is a different debate. You've got the two major parties being led by two new people. Now, one of them is pretty well known, and that's Pierre Poilievre. So is there a chance that he can surprise people with the way that he comes across in the debate? Potentially. You saw what his weaknesses are. Can he offset that to a certain extent and become more of, look more like a prime minister who's in waiting? And then you've got Mark Carney, who people basically don't know. They have really high expectations of who he is. We asked in our global news poll, who do you think is going to win the French debate? Who's going to win the English debate? The French debate, Canadians think that Pierre Poilievre and Yves Blanchette are going to win those debates, and Mark Carney's not going to do very well. But in the English language debate, he's almost 2-to-1 over Pierre Poilievre in terms of his ability to perform. So the expectations around Mark Carney in that debate are considerable, and he's a new person. People don't know him very well, and the assumption is that he's cool, calm, collected under pressure, because that's how he's presented himself. And Pierre Poilievre is a person who deals quite well with people who are cool, calm, and collected under pressure. So we'll see how that dynamic plays out. So I think actually this time around there is potential for the debate to actually mean something, and we haven't seen that in a Canadian election campaign in a while.
Very good, thank you, Darrell. I'm starting to see some questions come in. There's some interest here around the performance of the NDP, around 10%. You showed on one of your first slides. Historically, the NDP is around 20% or so, fluctuating depending on the election. So, what is causing Canadians to sort of suddenly reevaluate the NDP's position? Why are they doing so historically poorly?
Well, because the NDP gave up their position as a party of change on the ballot, and they did that by getting so closely aligned with the Liberal Party. I don't think history is going to be kind to this particular version of the NDP or to their leader. And the Liberals, I mean, their strategy is really clear. I mean, one of the most interesting things to watch on this is to go back and watch Justin Trudeau's resignation presentation in front of Rideau Cottage. And he talks about the Liberal Party, but he talks an awful lot about progressive voters. So the way that the Liberal Party looks at campaigning is that the progressive vote in Canada is bigger than the Conservative vote. It always is. But when the progressive vote is split between two parties, that's when the Conservatives win. So the first job of the Liberal Party is to collapse the NDP vote. Now, they got a lot of help this time around from Pierre Poilievre because he's not an option for NDP voters, except maybe for private sector union NDP voters, he becomes more of an option. But what they were able to do successfully at the start of this campaign is to collapse the NDP vote. But I say that the Liberals collapsed and the NDP collapsed themselves. I mean, what they should have done, and it was obvious to anybody who has any experience in politics, is you look back at last spring when the Liberals brought in their budget. That was the time for the NDP to defeat the Liberals. They would have forced the Liberal Party to run with Justin Trudeau as their leader, and they would have taken away the ability of the Liberal Party to time the election. They gave them back both of them for basically nothing. And as a result, now they're going to be challenged to get their official party status back. And when that happens, the question is, are we going to see, just like we saw on the right side of the political spectrum? John Ibbitson and I wrote a book called The Big Shift about this, where the right got its act together. We also talked about in that book that at some point the left is going to consolidate its support probably behind one party. The likelihood of that will happen is stronger after this next election campaign, especially if the Liberal Party wins than it's ever been.
And based on what we're seeing in British Columbia, Darrell, is Jagmeet Singh's own riding potentially in jeopardy?
Well, you know, even 10% in terms of national support doesn't specifically talk about what's happening in a riding, but I think he would have to be worried.
Mm. There's a question here about climate change, and on the issue list, you showed it wasn't in the top 10 even. Is that about where it is normally? Is it historically low? And if it is low, why is it just not on the radar anymore?
Well, climate change was a big issue in, pardon me, in 2019, both in Canada and globally, and slightly, you know, after and slightly before that. But the combination of the pandemic, the cost of living crisis, and now what we're dealing with the United States and trade and all of the things that are associated with that have basically pushed it off the public agenda. It's not that people don't care about the climate. Every survey that we go out and do, we find that people do think climate is important. They also think it's something that's caused by human beings. I mean, 80% of the population in the world thinks that. They think that somebody should be doing something about it, but they don't know what that is. And that's where the thinking shuts down. So they move on to things that are more immediate and in their own personal lives. So what we've seen in general in politics around the world, in the developed democracies where we do polling, and Ipsos does them in many of them, is that what's happened is Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you know, where it's survival's at the top and at the bottom, or sorry, self-actualization, making the world a better place, is at the top, and at the bottom is everything related to survival. What's happened is that that hierarchy has moved very close. So our sense of the future is now 2 weeks from now, or maybe a month from now, not 5 years. And everything that we're looking at is in terms of our own personal situation. There are still people who are focused on things like climate, but they are a small minority of the voting population at the moment. But it's not that they don't think it's important, it's just that it's not relevant at this time, and they really don't know what it is that they can do about it anyway.
Right, right. There's a question here on the issues. It's about the ballot box question. You mentioned that it was, you know, Trump, and yet Canada's relationship with the United States was fifth on the list. Is it still the ballot box question, or is that shifting over time?
No, I don't think it's the ballot box question at all. I think the ballot box question is leadership. It's very similar to what it was back in 1988. Which leader do you trust to lead you through this moment? And when you think that it's about a need to change things in order to improve affordability and get the economy back on track and give you a fair break, all the stuff that Pierre Poilievre is talking about, that time for a change agenda, then Pierre Poilievre is probably your choice. If you think that really the existential crisis that we're facing in Canada right now is dealing with Donald Trump in the United States, then you probably think it's Mark Carney. So depending on which of those leaders you think is the right person, that's the ballot box question. So they're not walking in thinking specifically of party choice. Party choice is a proxy for those other things we just discussed.
Right, right. There's a question here about the potential impact of some of the discussion coming out of Ontario, you know, with Doug Ford and his campaign manager, you know, calling Pierre Poilievre's campaign, you know, malpractice and other disastrous words. Does that have an impact, or is that just inside baseball that doesn't really impact voters?
Pardon me. Well, you know, there's this idea that political parties are all just one big family, and it's not true. You know, in the federal Liberal Party and well, there are no provincial Liberal parties of significance anymore, other than New Brunswick, where they have the government. Although I'm going to be getting emails now from people telling me how great their Liberal Party is doing in their province, but the NDP is basically filled in that spot in many provinces now. But there's not necessarily close affiliation. There never has been in the Conservative Party, rarely in the Liberal Party. So that they tussle a bit is not uncommon. And both of them, the provincial party and the federal party, they have enough professionals running their campaigns that just because one group doesn't want to play doesn't mean that there's not another whole group of people who can do things. But where it does become an issue is that the Venn diagram, the circle, of people who actually work on behalf of the Conservative Party at the riding level or Progressive Conservative Party, the overlap is nearly 100%. So that's where it's a problem. In those ridings where you're relying on local people who would work federally for the Conservative Party and the same group of people who would probably work locally for the provincial Progressive Conservative Party are now conflicted. And it could potentially be a demotivating sort of thing. So not helpful for the Poilievre campaign first of all, because it just knocks it off its news cycle and it needs to talk about it. The leaders even had to talk about it. So that's not helpful, but the real damage could actually be done at the riding level when you need volunteers to get your vote out.
There's a question here, and my guess is it's coming from somebody outside of Ontario, because the question is, are Ontarians that fickle, or that they vote, one way provincially, so significantly delivering forward a majority government not months ago, and now federally they're leading quite substantially towards the Liberal Party. We don't see that level of volatility in other provinces, do we?
I'm trying to think. Sometimes we can. I mean, but Ontario's notorious for this. I mean, having a federal government and a provincial government of different parties happens all the time. The real question we should ask is, why is the 905 so fickle? Because not only do they prefer, a progressive conservative in a provincial campaign and a federal liberal in a national campaign, but they do it en masse. So it's not like there's half of the 905 ridings go one way and half go the other way. They go en masse to one party or the other. And that's the story of Canadian politics now. If you want to understand who's going to win, you really need to look at who's winning in the 905. And for all those who don't know what the 905 is, it's the donut of constituencies that sit around the city of Toronto. The CN Tower is kind of the epicenter of that, and it's all the things that are out probably, a 45-minute to a 90-minute drive outside of the city of Toronto. And there's more if you add up and extend that out to Kitchener-Waterloo and past Pickering up to Belleville, those areas that are still, interestingly enough, can act as commuter towns, particularly after COVID. There's more seats there almost than there is in the entire province of Quebec. I mean, Quebec actually lost a seat in the redistribution. Ontario picked up a couple, and they picked them up in the car commuting suburbs of Toronto, and that's where elections are now decided. So, does downtown side with the suburbs side with downtown, or do they side with small town rural Ontario? If they side with small town rural Ontario, the progressive conservatives and the conservatives win. If they side with downtown, then the Liberals and the New Democrats tend to do reasonably well. In Ontario, it's usually the Liberals. Actually, provincially these days, it's more the New Democrats than the Liberals in terms of downtown Toronto. So that's the dynamic of the campaign. It's all about, does Quebec side with Ontario and the suburbs side with the downtowns in Ontario? And then after that, if the Conservatives are successful, it's the West. I don't like to talk about the West. It's actually the Wests, because they're very different. Do the big bulk of seats in the Wests side with the suburbs in outside of Toronto. If that happens, you get a result like Stephen Harper had in 2011. And that's a new way of winning, and it's why John Ibbitson and I wrote The Big Shift, is to say it isn't all just about reuniting the wrenching consensus political strategy anymore. There's a new one, and the new conservative strategy starts out west and works its way back east, whereas the liberal strategy starts in Quebec and works its way east and to Ontario, a bit west.
On the very first slide that you showed, Darrell, there was unbelievable variation, over time, even a short period of time, the last 4 months really, with the Conservatives up 26 points at one point, and then we had the Liberals up double digits at one point, and we're now coming back, to sort of a 6-point lead. So there's been variation both in terms of our polling, but then there's been variation across pollsters at any given moment of time, with some showing almost a dead heat, and others with still quite a substantial Liberal lead. What's going on there in terms of all of the variation in the polls? Is it methodological? Is it just a point in time? Is it a volatile electorate? Help us understand that.
I think it's both. Depending on the day that you're in field, the days that you're in field, you could catch an updraft, and I think that's what we got last week. Got the Liberals at their peak, and within the margin of error where other polls were, but certainly we were among the highest. If not, I don't think we were the highest, but had the gap the biggest. But then there's maybe one or two others that had it bigger. But it's a combination of the two things. We do know at Ipsos, because we do polling all over the world, that the way we used to do it is not the way that it's done anymore, and nobody does it the way that it's done before. In the old days, when I first started in this, remember this is my federal election campaign number 12. Back in those days when I was working with Alan Gregg at Decima, you could go out and do a telephone poll, and you get an 80% response rate, a random digit dialing, an 80% response rate, and to get the election wrong would be like falling out of a boat and missing the water. I mean, it was really hard to do. These days it's completely different. And the reason is because there's no one way to get the right result. And everybody is not doing, I mean, we talk about doing a poll. Yes, polling is part of it, but it's really actually more modeling. And every single pollster is doing some form of modeling. And that's because we know that different methodologies advantage certain parts of the population. So Sean and I have worked on this a lot together. And we know when you do online research, you tend to get people who are more emphatic in their political beliefs. Why is that? Well, usually because people are on panels, which means that you have to sign up, which means you have to be more interested than the average bear in reflecting your political views. So we know that there's going to be people who are more emphatic about what they're saying. And where that we really find that play out is with progressive voters. So particularly New Democrats, who you tend to online get their numbers a bit higher, because they are people who are really committed and really want to express their view. More committed than the average New Democrat is basically what I'm saying. So they tend to poll better than they perform. The Green Party is exactly that. They tend to do almost double on polls better than they actually do on election day. So we have a methodology for dealing with that. So every single pollster is dealing with that. If somebody's doing telephone polls, and we have people who are doing live operator, but a lot fewer of them these days. By the way, when we do our surveys, we do mixed methodology. So we do a combination of online and telephone because of the second thing I'm going to tell you, which is if you're doing surveys on telephones, even if you're doing a combination of landline and cell phone, and most people are doing disproportionate numbers of people on cell phone. I think our ratios, I don't know, Sean, 60-40 or 70-30 cell phone to landline. We still know that we get more conservative voters by telephone. And that's because older people tend to be more comfortable doing that type of responding to a survey that way, and they tend to vote conservative. And so we have to adjust for that. Now, one of the interesting wrinkles in this election season is that the demographic tendencies have flipped. And what we find now is that people who are older are more likely to be voting for the Liberals, the progressive option, and younger people are more likely to be voting for the conservative option. The reason for that, we hypothesize, is that older people are actually quite fearful about hanging on to the Canada that they remember. So it's not quite a nostalgic thing, but it's this idea that I have to hold on to what I remember our country being. And by the way, the Mark Carney, Mike Myers ad was a great representation of this. It was two guys who grew up in the 1970s celebrating the Canada of the 1970s. And what they remember and what they see as great in being Canadian. But then there's another generation of people, more Gen X, sorry, not Gen X, but more millennial and Gen Zs, and their reaction to how the Canadian promise is working is it's not paying off. So they're very supportive of changing things, even in the face of Donald Trump, particularly young men. And their view is, you know what, that Canada that you guys are holding on to, it doesn't work for me. I'd actually like somebody to change it. So we're seeing that dynamic, which is a new dynamic. So every time we do looking at what we get on telephone, what we get online. We're trying to model those out to accurately represent the demography of the population. But we're also trying to make sure that from a political perspective, we're not getting people who are too emphatic one way or the other for the left or the right, to make sure that we have the right level of representation of those populations in the political marketplace. So these days, it's not so much about random anything. It's more about making sure that you represent the span of opinions that exist in the political marketplace, and you represent them in the right weight. And doing things randomly doesn't necessarily create that.
Right, right. Thank you.
A long technical answer for which I apologize, but there are probably people who are into those sorts of things, and that's about as long-winded an explanation as I've given on that topic.
Well, and interesting, and you pointed out that Ipsos does this dual mode online and telephone, and we're, if not the only one of the only ones to do that, and that's sort of a method in political polling that we've innovated and pioneered here.
I should say, Sean, one other thing. That's the way we prefer to do it. It's the one that works for us. But there are many ways that you can get good election predictions. So I'm not being critical of any of the other pollsters who do them any other way. There's many ways to get to the right answer.
We've got a question here that came in as you were speaking. And it asks about the trends that you're seeing emerging in terms of momentum. You know, there's a lot of effort put it. Well, who's got the momentum right now? Is it the Tories? Is it the Liberals? Is there enough time? You know, could we see a surge of one party between now and the election day? And I guess, what would the catalyst be? Is it just the debate, or are there other things that we can be looking for to spot momentum and what the effects of that might be?
That's a really good question. At the moment, I would say that the Conservatives have momentum, and only because it's gone from 12 to 6. And when you look at the key indicators like leadership, it's tightening up. Time for change is moving up. Their issue is moving up, which is affordability. So they have momentum at the moment. But I wrote a piece for Global National. You can go online and take a look at it. And what I said about momentum is it's difficult to create, even more difficult to manage, and very, very difficult to measure. So based on what I just showed you, it looks like the Conservatives have momentum, but it could go away tomorrow, depending on what happens in the news cycle. If the big orange man decides to get up and say a whole bunch of things about Canada and decides to erase the line on a map and hold it up, and well, that's going to change things as well. So it's very, very difficult to, as I said before, to cause to happen. It's something that kind of happens a bit out of a few things going correctly in your campaign, and a lot of external things breaking in your direction. And the Conservatives at the moment seem to have momentum.
And this is now a question for me as a follow-up. Do you think that Donald Trump sort of easing up on Canada in the last couple of weeks, maybe focusing attention elsewhere, has that played to the Conservatives' advantage?
My hypothesis is that's what's happening. So I think some of the intensity, the immediate threat, has come out of Donald Trump, and what that's allowed as he's moved on to China, as he's moved on to attacking Harvard University, as he's moved on to dealing with immigration issues in El Salvador and all these types of things. And he's not talking specifically about Canada. He's still talking about tariffs, but it's really more of other places. He's not specifically pointing a finger at Canada. That eases things up a little bit and allows that other issue, which is affordability, to come back in, and that works to the advantage of the Conservatives. So my hypothesis is that's what we're seeing happening here.
Another question from a live viewer here is, well, their own personal assessment was that Mark Carney didn't stand out as being a strong performer in the Liberal leadership debate. I mean, you can have your opinion on that. If you take that as truth, why are people so optimistic about his performance this week then?
The same reason that they believe he's the right person to deal with all of these issues. I actually think it's a visual vibe. He just looks the part. He looks like a person who would be able to do really well in a debate. But I would call that Liberal leadership debate that we saw, I think there was 2 of them, to me it would look like hockey practice with no hitting, no pads, and no puck. I mean, it wasn't a debate at all. It was, people trying not to offend Mark Carney because they hope they're going to end up in his cabinet.
Right.
So now he's going to be facing somebody somebody desperate, Jagmeet Singh, somebody who doesn't care, Yves Blanchette, who's going to just try and embarrass him, and somebody who is manufactured in an elite killing factory beneath Tory headquarters, Pierre Poilievre. So it's going to be quite a different thing. And I actually think that Mr. Carney's vulnerabilities are not going to be on his performance in French. I don't think that that's going to be that big an issue. It might be for some voters, but I think that his issue in French is going to be how he deals with complete physical discomfort. Not being the smartest guy in the room, because his lack of French language ability doesn't allow him to be that. And how he deals with that is going to be very interesting. And that could carry over into the English language debate where expectations are really high. And so when Jagmeet Singh, Pierre Poilievre, the Green Party, I don't know why they're in these debates. I mean, they're polling so badly right now. It makes no sense. It's just a distraction. And Pierre Poilievre are on that stage. Going after him, and everybody's going to be going after him. There's going to be no attention to any of the other leaders as they try to bring him back to earth. How he's going to hold up under that.
Right.
It's going to be very interesting. He's a person who's used to sitting in front of adoring crowds, on panels with other smart people at very elite audiences. And he's used to sitting in boardrooms doing the hand steeples and being very wise. But somebody telling him he's a liar, or questioning his ethics, or going after him based on his past record and really making it very personal, he doesn't deal with that as well. And you've seen what's happened when he's been questioned on that basis. I'm sure that the Liberal Party debate prep people are as well tuned to this as anything that I'm saying. They're well ahead of it, and they're trying to get them ready for it. But it's one thing to get ready for it in practice. It's quite another thing to deal with it when it's happening to you on the stage. So if he's able to get through that, I think that it gets him into the next phase of the campaign. But since expectations are already so high, it's almost like he's got two options. He does badly, or he gets by it.
Right. I guess Poilievre's challenge will be to both be a tack dog to throw Carney off balance, but also seem prime ministerial in the process. The theme of today's discussion is Ask Me Anything, and so there were a couple of questions that came in ahead of the webinar, and I figured we'd probably hear something about it. But of course, the polling in the U.S. seemed to systematically underrepresent Trump supporters, and a couple of the questions sort of allude to, methodological accuracy and whether we have similar, systemic bias here in Canadian polling that may be underrepresenting conservative support, particularly given the size of the crowds that we're seeing at their rallies.
Well, the situation in the U.S. is a very peculiar one and a specific one. So there's a specific group of voters who are Trump voters who have decided they will never participate in a survey. And normally that's not a problem because there are other people who are in the survey who have a similar type of profile that we can actually capture and represent their views, and we can weight them to make sure that they're properly represented in the voter profile. The problem is that when you look at more of a mainstream Republican versus a Trump Republican, demographically, attitudinally, they don't really look that different. But for some reason, they show up on election day in a different kind of with a different kind of a weight. And so it's difficult to get that. In Canada, we haven't had that experience. Last two elections, but the last election in particular, the People's Party should have been a similar group of people, but most of the pollsters did a pretty good job. In fact, to the extent that anybody got the People's Party wrong, it wasn't that they got them too high, too low, they got them too high. Yeah. So we haven't really experienced that. I have seen it before in Canada, but it tends to relate it was two times that I've seen it in over history. One of them was back when we were doing referendum polling back in 1995. And people who were Federalist voters being uncomfortable saying that they were Federalist voters to telephone surveyors in Quebec. So we tended to get the sovereigntists a bit higher than they actually performed on election day.
Mhm.
So that was one time, and it's in social science, it's called social desirability bias. You want to tell people what they want to hear, but add in a fear factor as well, talking to a person and telling them something that they know that is unpopular. And we've seen this in other referenda around the world too, Scotland being a good example. The other time was when the Reform Party was just starting off, and that's when people were a little bit embarrassed to say that they were voting for the Reform Party. What we have in the current political spectrum, based on what you're seeing in the riot in these campaign events, is people who are definitely not embarrassed to say that they're voting for the Conservatives. So I don't think that we're going to suffer the same kind of thing, but we are mindful of it. We're looking at it all the time. We're comparing our telephone results to our online results. We're going through what the profiles of the various groups of voters are looking for to make sure that we're not missing anything. And I will say in the last, every federal election campaign that I've been involved in, all 12 of them, the polling's actually been really good. And in the last 2 elections in particular, which were really hard because you actually had the party winning the popular vote lose the election, calling that right, and most of the pollsters did call that right, was the equivalent of splitting a diamond for a jeweler, doing it perfectly. I'm not saying that the polls are perfect, but I am saying that we tend to do a pretty good job, and we haven't suffered from that yet. But we are mindful of the problem.
A question here from a viewer: if the theme is leadership in this election, I guess that raises the stakes for the party leaders. How probable is it that Monsieur Poilievre or Singh, or Carney for that matter, would resign if they don't win the election?
I think of the 3 of them, Mr. Singh will be the person who will be under the most immediate pressure. I mean, because there are such strategic blunders all the way through for the NDP, but the NDP have a tendency to put up with an awful lot. So even though I'm saying that, that's not generally the pattern. They did throw out Thomas Mulcair, but I think that was basically because they didn't like him, and didn't really see him as a New Democrat. He was a Quebec Liberal. But I would think from a logical perspective, Singh should be under the most trouble. Poilievre, let's talk about each of them separately. Carney, if it's a minority government, maybe he stays around. If it's a minority conservative government, if it's a majority conservative government, I wonder if he does.
Right.
And that would be like a personal choice thing. He's in this for one thing. Remember, he's been very clear about why he's doing this. This is a specific moment in time in which they need a specific type of leader who has his skills for this moment. It's not like I've always wanted to be prime minister and this is just the next evolution of it. It's not. He said he's offering himself up as almost as community service. And this is this very special time when you need me to do this. So if Canadians reject him on that basis, it'd be interesting to see how he responds to it. Pierre Poilievre will be really interesting because essentially the elements of the Conservative Party, and I don't call them Tories anymore, although I slip into it all the time. I refer to this party as the 21st century Conservatives. They're different from the old Progressive Conservatives. They definitely are more populist. They definitely have a more, I would say, well-developed sense of what their position on the right is than previous Progressive Conservative parties. And this is what John and I wrote about in The Big Shift, which is basically the Progressive Conservatives and the Liberals were interchangeable. One wore blue and one wore red, but really that was the only difference. It's very different from that now. And there has to be somebody else in the caucus. Remember why Aaron O'Toole got knocked off? He got knocked off because there was a substantial group of members in the caucus that were willing to give him a very short leash in the election campaign, that if he didn't win, they weren't going to back him. And those were all the people who were aligned with Pierre Poilievre on the right side of the political agenda. So is there a group like that in the Tory caucus right now? Not that I've seen. So I don't know that he will be under as much pressure. Probably his biggest pressure, and I'm just going to say it right here, is probably from somebody like Premier Ford. I mean, it's by the way, it's no coincidence that they're doing what they're doing. I think, Pierre Premier Ford's like Alexander the Great. He wept because there was no more lands to conquer. And he won 3 majority governments. What's next for Doug Ford? 4, maybe, but you know, I think particularly given Mark Carney's lack of facility in French, is there a possibility that there could be a conservative leader who isn't very well, doesn't present himself very well in French, that could have a chance in Quebec? I think, you know, in late night conversations and, you know, looking through the mists of time, they see a possibility for Prime Minister Doug Ford. Maybe that's possible.
Right.
So that would be probably more pressure from there. I mean, there are, you know, centrist progressive conservatives that have run, but they've been rejected out of hand, you know, since basically 2002. I mean, Stephen Harper was, you know, put the party together with Peter MacKay. And then after that, you know, Jean Charest's run, he's lost. Peter MacKay's run, he's lost. And these were supposed to be champions on that other side, and the other side is not really well organized anymore. Progressive conservatives, you know, like blue liberals, are kind of mythical beasts. They sort of exist in our mind, and you can find them on surveys, but they don't really represent emphatic voting blocks in Canadian politics. Remember, you know, 35% of the people that we're interviewing on every survey are lying to us. They're not going to vote. We only know about 65 to 70% are going to show up, and that's a really good turnout.
Right.
So, you know, anyway, that's how I see it evolving, but this is pure speculation. I have no inside evidence or knowledge of what any of the leaders are thinking, and it's really unfair, I think, to either for me to speculate or for me to be asked to do it, but I can't.
But we've done it anyways. There's a question here from a viewer who wants to know about the importance of national unity. That's, you know, obviously key priority of any prime minister. Just a couple of months ago, you know, we've tested questions on, you know, Western alienation. We saw the Bloc not that long ago was, you know, resurging again in Quebec, which obviously opens that question. So where is national unity right now in the minds of Canadians? Are we together again because Trump's at our throats, or is this always a percolating issue?
No, it's a percolating issue, and it could be moved from percolating to boiling, depending on what happens in the federal election. Now, Sean, we asked, you were very involved in this, asked a question that is my marker on this, and that is, if the United States approached Canadians and offered them the opportunity of full citizenship and having their assets converted into US dollars, would you vote for it? 30% of Canadians said yes. 30%. That's not nothing. By the way, sovereignty in Quebec right now is around 30, 31, 35, depending on the polls that you look at. So not that far off. Among Gen Z, that number is 50. I think it was 49. So I don't think the question about in Canada anymore is about national unity and sovereignty. I think the question is about annexation. And Western separatism, we ask about, and we make the same mistake. It's not a mistake, we've got to change. The question is going to move from, for the West, would you like to separate from Canada? That's not the question. The question is, would you like to merge with the United States? So it's not, talking about Western separatism is wrong. People are not pounding the drums out there, and I think in any realistic way, that Western Canada, and by the way, the Wests, so I'm talking specifically about Saskatchewan and Alberta right now, the talk that would be more worrisome on that front is not them forming an independent state. It would be them deciding that they want to be the 51st state of the United States. Quebec doesn't, that option is not as attractive for them. And the reason it's not as attractive is because they don't want to become Louisiana. And, you know, the protections that they're afforded for language rights in Canada, the willingness of the United States, I mean, they just passed an executive order to not allow Spanish to be an official language. You know, American is the only official language, you know, English obviously, but so the accommodation for a completely different culture and completely different language in the United States is minimal. Quebec's options are probably forming its own country, and how do you do that in this current context? Very difficult. You know, the biggest problem that they have is the sovereignty movement in the province of Quebec has become an old person's movement. Young people are not as keen as older people are on the sovereignty movement. And I'm old enough to remember when the sovereignty movement was a young person's movement. It was a revolutionary movement. It was a state-based movement. It was not about nativism. They had a very affirmative view of what their role would be in the world as an independent country, with the power of Hydro-Quebec behind them and the power of the Quebec state. This was not a defensive type of a position on sovereignty, which is kind of what the Bloc Québécois is, and kind of what the Péquistes are now in the province of Quebec. So I would say that on the national unity question, the one that concerns me the most is the one in Saskatchewan and Alberta.
Okay. I think we've got time for maybe two more questions here, Darrell. There's one from a viewer curious how important immigration is in this election, and what changes can we expect in Canada's level of openness to welcoming new Canadians. Obviously, there's lots of implications on business and economic growth. So what can we expect?
It hasn't been an issue in the election campaign. In fact, Doug Saunders, who's written some great work on this in the Globe and Mail, and wrote a book called, I forget what it is, but look up Doug Saunders and you'll see it on Amazon, on Canadian immigration policy. And wrote an editorial in the Globe and Mail saying, why isn't immigration an issue in this campaign? And he's right, it's not. And it's because we're focused on these two things: affordability and the United States. And what's happened on immigration, though, is that the consensus in Canada on the topic is broken down. There used to be a three-party consensus on this. Canadians were generally behind the idea of immigration as being a positive thing in Canada, and that's changed over the space of particularly the last 3 or 4 years. And the reason for that is because we've been immigrating, bringing in workers and not citizens. And we've struggled, particularly with temporary foreign workers and the effect that it's had on the cost of housing and all sorts of other things. So it used to be that we would go out, Sean and I, and do a survey, and our colleagues in public affairs here at Ipsos in Canada, you'd always find a group of people who just didn't like immigrants, but that would only get you to like 25%, or maybe 20%, or maybe even less than that. But to get it into majority, and which is where we are, who are opposed to immigration right now, you needed other things. And what's happened over the course of the last 4 or 5 years, and particularly over the last couple, is that reasonable people who aren't bigoted now have a reason to be opposed to expanding immigration. So what has to happen is we have to turn away from this being a numbers game and to start talking about, again, the quality of people that we're going to be bringing into this country, and what it is that we're bringing them in to do, and how it makes us better off if we do it. Because that's originally the thing that the Canadian government did a really good job of, and doesn't, and the Trudeau government really struggled with that.
Right. One final question here for you, oh wise Darrell, before we let you go. On what's next post-election, you know, we've got, this was submitted before the session. We're always looking ahead at trends that shape consumer and the public mindset. So based on what you're seeing now, what will Canada look like? This is going to be very difficult to sum up quickly, under a Liberal government, and what will Canada look like under a Pierre Poilievre conservative-led government?
Well, I think that before we get to that, we should just say majority and minority.
Yeah, okay. Well,
if there's a minority government, it depends on the construction of it,
yeah,
and how stable it appears.
Okay, well, let's say majority. Let's assume it's because that's the cleanest.
Okay, majority conservative government and majority Liberal government.
Yeah.
The first thing that's going to happen is that if it's a majority Liberal government or a majority conservative government, essentially what President Trump has said is he's delaying any negotiations in Canada until we have a new prime minister. And I think that you know, there's 3 existential questions that any Canadian prime minister needs to deal with. Number 1 is the economy needs to be going well. Number 2, national unity. Number 3, our relationship with the United States. Therefore, existential question number 3 will be existential question number 1, which is starting into whatever process that Donald Trump allows. And we can say that we're demanding it, but even, I mean, we talk about how great Canada was in negotiating the last agreement, basically what happened is the United States said, okay, Canada, if you're going to be difficult to deal with, we'll just put into place a deal with Mexico. And if you want that one, you're allowed to come back in. And maybe we'll do a couple things around the edges for you so you can save face, but that's what it's going to be. And that's what it ended up being. So the real question will be whether or not what the terms and conditions of Canada participating in a negotiation with Donald Trump will be. And that'll be the fundamental preoccupation for both Pierre Poilievre and Mark Carney. If it's a Liberal government that's elected and it's a majority, the biggest question he's going to be dealing with very quickly and from a domestic policy perspective is, particularly if he doesn't win a lot of seats in Saskatchewan and in Alberta, is the national unity question. Because there's going to be two very dissatisfied premiers who have pretty strong mandates from their publics. Both of them have majority governments. Dealing with that will be, remember I said there were 3 existential questions. That's the other one that will come back up. And then after that, we'll turn to how are we going to get our economy back on track? The 3rd existential question, and how are we going to start dealing with the issues of creating an economy that is less dependent on the United States, a military that's able to defend the country, a national sense of national pride and engagement in Canada from our citizens that's been waning. I mean, we did a survey around last Canada Day, and the results were shocking. You know, what was it? Only 30% of Canadians said they were proud to be Canadian. I mean, it's like, it's pretty tough to, you know, have a country in which you can't defend yourself. You're entirely dependent on one trading partner, and people aren't even proud to be part of it. So all of those things are going to be questions that any government is going to have to deal with. I think that the Poilievre government will deliver on some of the things that it's been saying. You know, I think if you're working at the CBC, you're probably going to be concerned. I think if you're somebody who's working in government, that they're going to do some things to reduce the size of government. I think that the business community, I think that he was very honest in what he said about the business community. You need to create a new type of establish a new type of relationship. It's not going to be smoky back rooms anymore. You've got to convince the public that you've got good ideas, and then you can come and talk to us. So I think that there's going to be some changes like that. The Carney government, to me, Carney is more like Lester Pearson. You know, somebody who's an internationally recognized individual. He may have some ideas about what he wants to do with government, but to this point, he's really only talked about one issue in any kind of consistent way, and it's how he's going to deal with Canada-U.S. relations and how we're going to deal with our international relationships with other countries to our advantage. So I think that that's what you're going to see from the various governments. I'm not going to waste my time talking about the NDP. The only question on that one is, do they get their official party status back? Yeah. And if it's a minority government situation, do they align with the Liberals again? And the answer to that question is yes, times 3.
Right. Well, Darrell, thanks for your insights. And to those viewing, you can continue to watch Darrell on Global News throughout the election campaign. And on election night, we'll have our election day survey, where we survey upwards of 10,000 people on election day. And Darrell will be at the big board talking about those results on election night.
With all our friends, including Sean, who will be there with us, and Cynthia Cynthia's going to come to Global with us, our CEO here in Canada. So we're looking forward to having her join us. And yeah, I'm also on the Hub. So if you want to watch me there, I'm with Sean Spear on a pretty regular basis, where I think a pretty good discussion about what's going on in Canadian politics. Actually, I did Pamela Wallen's podcast yesterday too. So all over the place.
No shortage of insights to be had on the election. Again, thank you all for attending. Ellen has posted details about our next webinar. Please join us. And if nothing else, go vote. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.